For our Gatsby Lecture tonight, we're lucky to have Iain Couzin. So the Gatsby Lecture, I think it's a time for all of us who are interested in collective behavior of the brain, and neurons in particular. This is a general theme in Cosyne. And I think the Gatsby Lecture is a time for us to sort of broaden our horizons, think about other disciplines that sort of mirror our own. So Iain Couzin's the director of the Max Planck Institute of Ornithology in Constance and the chair of the Department of Collective Behavior. He moved there from Princeton, where he was a faculty member for a while. So Iain's done sort of a large series of work looking at the collective behavior of insect societies, animal societies, and human societies. And I'm hoping a lot of us can get inspiration from the kinds of work he does and maybe bring it to our own studies of the brain. All right, so let's welcome Iain.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've always wanted to come to Cosyne, and this is my first meeting, so I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So I work on collective animal behavior. And ever since I was a kid, when I saw footage like this, again from David Attenborough, I was absolutely fascinated by how and why organisms like this, who are unrelated to each other, coordinate their behavior. And in my department, we study collective behavior across all scales of organization, from the very simplest animal on our planet, called Placozoa. It's a swarm of cells. It's in its own phylum at the base of the metazoan tree. And this is real data showing the motion of these cells collectively interacting. So really, collective behavior is a fundamental aspect of where we came from. We also study collective behavior in insects, such as locust swarms. I don't have time to talk about it today, but we've created various experimental systems, such as tracking systems, to allow us to look at how these animals interact, and discovered that these apparently cooperative societies are driven by cannibalism. Everyone is trying to eat everyone else and trying to avoid being eaten. Perhaps a message for our own society, which is arguably the most complex animal we study. These are human beings, of course, in a railway station in London, where we've developed tracking software that tracks not just the motion of the pedestrians, but where each individual is looking. And so what fascinates me and what differentiates collective behavior in these biological systems from physical systems is this concept of information transfer. So when we see a predator, such as this trumpetfish attacking a silverside school, you can see why in the 1950s and 60s and even into the early 70s, it was believed there must be thought transference or telepathy among these individuals, allowing them to coordinate their behavior in this way. And so I'm fascinated by how we understand quite a lot. I mean, of course, you guys are the experts about how the individual mind works. But what about when minds come together and you have social connectivity among them? Can we think of collective minds or collective cognition within these types of groups? And one of the challenges, as you can see from this tight interplay of social interactions, we can't just use verbal arguments to understand how the local interactions scale up to collective behaviors. And so we've resorted to using computer simulations to try to get inside the mind of the individual to see how and why it behaves the way it does. Because when I started this research, there was no experimental data. Not just a dearth of data, there was zero data. And so I started with very simple computational models that speculated how these individuals, such as individual I that has position at centroid C at time t, interacts with others within the local neighborhood. For example, if individuals become too close to each other, they can exhibit a tendency to avoid each other. This maintains the close personal space, and actually avoiding collision for some species like birds is really important because collision can be fatal. However, if you become isolated from the group, you will lose the benefits of group living, which I will come to shortly. And so individuals exhibit a tendency to be attracted towards each other, which is the first part of this equation, and also to tend to align their directions of travel with near neighbors. And so these interactions are self-organized. They're relatively local. And so if we imagine the world around the individual, they're interacting with, they're being influenced by, and are influencing a relatively local neighborhood. Now, I'll come back to what that neighborhood is in a moment. And these types of models allowed us to simulate the dynamics that you see within these groups. The individuals need not detect directly the predator. By detecting the response of others, you can have these waves of interaction, these waves of turning that propagate much, much faster than the predator can move. And that's why it's so tricky for these predators to get these individuals when they are within collectives. But of course, modeling is extremely important. It gives us new ways of thinking, it gives us new concepts. But in 2008, when I was able to set up my lab in Princeton, I decided I really wanted to study the real experimental systems and to try to develop the technology required to get the level of detail that was only possible previously for simulation. And so we turned to using golden shiner fish. These are bred in the billions in the United States. You can get 1,000 of them delivered to your doorstep for $70. And so, given my lab is mostly physicists, this was particularly important to us because we are really crap at fishing. And this is literally the first video we ever took. I'm not joking, the first video ever of 1,000 fish is slightly accelerated in time, but showing you this transition from this polarized motion into the milling motion. And I was so excited about this because we developed software. It took us about 10 years to develop software to track the motion of each individual within the group without mixing them up to understand how and why they moved the way they did. And so my early work, which wasn't, I didn't have the data, speculated how these types of interactions would lead to collective patterns. And very much like if we look at the physical environment around us, there's lots of ways that molecules can interact with each other. Yet around us at the macroscopic scale, at the collective scale, we see liquid, we see solid, we see gas. And if you play with physics a bit more, you see plasma. And so similarly, I predicted that there should be these fundamental states of matter that we should see in natural systems, in these natural groups. The swarm state on the left, the polarized state in the middle, and this milling state where the individuals are perpetually rotating around an empty core. But of course, there's nothing in the equations of motion that told them to do that. And so turning to our experimental data with over 100 hours of filming, these are the only states we have ever seen. And what causes the transition between these states, this is now experimental data, is simply the speed of the individuals. So in physics, you add energy through heat, for example. But in biological systems, these are far from equilibrium systems where the individuals, through their own metabolism, inject energy into the system. And that's extremely important. If there's not much energy in the system, if individuals are moving slowly, they'll be dense and disordered, much like a solid. Just by increasing speed, we transition the real system and the simulated system similarly into these locally ordered states with different global dynamics. And so we have a phase-like transition from local and global disorder to these ordered states just by individuals increasing speed. And that turns out to be very important for the way these groups perform collective computation. And that's what we studied in this particular paper. And this is work with Andrew Badal, who's now a professor at the University of Washington, and Colin Toney is a professor at Glasgow University. He was a PhD student and postdoc in my lab at the time. And so we set our groups a computational challenge. So at the top there, you're seeing the same experiment as is shown below, but this is recorded in visible light. The challenge for the fish is to find the global optimum solution, which in their case is a dark region. And there are going to be local optima. They love being in the dark because they're very hard to see in the dark. They have a 98% mortality per year at this stage of their life. And because we can't see them in the dark, what I'm showing you below is exactly the same experiment filmed in infrared light. So we've cut out the visible light. So you can now see the computation that the school performs. You can see them moving in this environment. And then we can isolate them and we can track them. And we can record both how they interact with each other and how they interact with this complex, time-varying environment. And here you can see the trajectories of the individuals. And we provided the first experimental evidence that indeed, as group size increased, the individuals become much, much better able to solve this problem. And so we thought to ourselves, well, this has got to be a classic example of the so-called wisdom of crowds. Now, in the wisdom of crowds, if, for example, each of us doesn't have a particularly good idea of what the circumference of Hungary is, for example, but we each make an independent estimate, it turns out the average of these estimates is not so far off the truth. And so we thought each individual must be making a local, noisy estimate of the environmental gradient and then pooling its estimates via the social interactions with others. Again, classic wisdom of crowds. But the really nice thing about doing experimental biology in addition to modeling is we can get surprises. So while the blue line here, the social vector, shows this extremely strong response to the social interactions to others, we found in the pink line no evidence that the individuals themselves, regardless of their group size, are capable of estimating the environmental gradient. And so this led us to a conundrum. If individuals are not capable of estimating the gradient, how on earth is the group able to do so? And it turns out natural selection has found a very elegant and simple solution. The fish simply slow down in environments that are dark, the environments they like, and they speed up in the light environments. Now that has no taxis, no gradient detection. Of course, on average, you'll spend slightly more time in the dark regions if you do this, but it turns out to be a pretty poor strategy, as we could see from the data. However, if we now have this strategy that just involves a local scalar measure of how good the environment is where you are, you don't need to detect anything complex. We looked for integration in time, we looked for integration in space, we found no evidence for that. And yet the interactions among the individuals give the group an awareness of the environment that the individuals simply do not have. And they will track the gradient. Another way of thinking about this is that if you recall before, I showed you that figure where individuals, if they slow down, they form this dense solid-like state. If they speed up, they become a fluid. That's exactly what's going on within the group. In the top right there, the individuals slow down and they form a solid. There's this very sudden phase-like transition. And the individuals in the light region remain in liquid phase. And it's this ability for the environment to change the phase structure of the group dynamically that allows the group collectively to compute the gradient, even though no individual is aware of the gradient. Natural selection has found a beautiful, simple rule that turns out to be provably optimal. Now, it sounds a bit group selection-y, and when you're working with the brain, you can often think about the collective as being the level of selection. But here, the individuals are selfish entities. They're genetically selfish. So how does this play out? So we also developed evolutionary models of completely selfish agents, and they will rapidly and readily evolve into this specific regime. This was with postdoc Andrew Hine, allowing them to collectively compute within the environment. They can even do all sorts of cool things. Regardless of how many resources in the environment, they will optimally allocate themselves to each, even though no individual is aware that there are any other resources. It's purely a physical computation. And so this gives rise to this very interesting interplay between what do individuals compute and what is computed by the network of interactions at the level of the collective. And our little golden shiner fish have inspired shiner bots. a new type of small robot that utilizes these collective algorithms and the famous kilobots of Radhika Nagpal at Harvard to climb these types of gradients. Now, I described relatively simplistic interactions among the individuals. That's where we started. As I mentioned, we had no data. But of course, these individuals are not responding through social forces as our physical systems. They're explicitly utilizing sensory information. And so we've also developed software that tracks not just the position, but the body posture of each individual, plus calculates the positions of the eyes, and uses graphics cards to reconstruct the pathways of photons onto the retina of each individual so we can reconstruct the world from the perspective of each animal within the collective. And here I'm showing you just a single individual with the left visual field shown in red and the right visual field shown in blue. And you can clearly see this is a complex, dynamic, informational acquisition on the part of the focal individual. And a hallmark of collective behavior, of many collective systems, is that the transition of behavior of one or several individuals can lead to this wave of response propagating across the group, much like I showed you before. And so to look at this in more detail, I worked with two of my graduate students, Bryn Rosenthal and Colin Toomey, to understand this transition, this wave of response across the group. So we could utilize our imaging software to specifically target, we experimentally worked out a way to specifically target any individual within the group. We could then cause a reflex response. So it's just driven by two giant neurons called Meissner cells. This is an escape response, as we saw previously with the mice. This is a collective escape response. And we conducted 205 experiments where we could control the initiator of the response. Now, if you look at the log-log scale of the cascade size versus the number of events, you can see that it's a very long-tailed distribution. It's hard a priori to understand whether an individual changing behavioral state will lead to a huge cascade across the whole group or will lead to no response whatsoever. So it's very hard for us to understand what's going on within this collective system. And so we needed to do something that's actually very tricky, which is to understand a functional mapping between the visual input and the motor response. And so like all organisms, now we're looking at vision, but this is true of all sensory modalities, we have this high-dimensional sensory input, such as the complex scene I'm seeing in front of me right now. What has the brain evolved to do? The brain has evolved to take this complexity and to use previous history and knowledge to translate this into low-dimensional behavioral output. And in our case, as I mentioned before, it's simply two cells making the decision. And so we used our computational visual field reconstruction, our body posture composition, and new techniques in machine learning to begin to understand how the brain conducts this dimensionality reduction. I don't have time to go into the details today, but of course they are there in the paper. And so we could work out which visual features the individuals are using to make their movement decisions. Interestingly, they turn out to be the simplest visual features they could possibly use. They are not using derivatives, for example, which completely was a surprise to me. But of course, you can see it works for them. And so what we can now do is reconstruct the hidden networks of communication that give rise to collective behavior. Now, these are not abstract networks. These edges actually represent probabilities. The probability that you will change behavior if I change behavior, and vice versa. And so if you're interested in the individual brain, which of course many of you are, since the inception of neuroscience, you go into the brain to dissect the circuits. You can see the circuits of interaction to understand how the individual mind works. Well, here we're developing new technology to try to understand how the circuits give rise to collective behavior, which of course are not visible. They have no physical form. And despite the fact that the individuals use the simplest possible features they could use, these networks tend to be weighted and directed, so quite complex. And so now you're going to see the first visualization ever of a real group of the network of communication that they use in this escape response. And the networks themselves are not small world. They're not scale-free. They're not in any of these categories that mathematicians have used. They're in their own unique domain, which actually is very interesting because they seem to have evolved to minimize correlation and to maximize escape response. And so we want to understand the relationship between social influence and the structure of these networks. Previously, people have speculated how information percolates, but no one has actually measured it in these animal groups. And so it's often assumed that the most socially influential individuals will be those with many connections to others. And in network literature, this is called a high degree, and whose neighbors have a low cliquishness. In the network literature, this is called a low clustering coefficient. Well, why is this assumed? It's assumed because there's a very large literature in epidemiology, and people think of behavior as like a very fast-spreading disease. Now, I don't believe I have a transmissible disease right now, or any disease for that matter, but say I did, right? The more people I connect to at this conference, the higher degree I have, probabilistically, the more I am likely to infect somebody. So it's very intuitive. However, if I only interact with the organizers of the conference, I don't want to interact with the riffraff, then I may infect them, but I'm not going to transmit that to you if we're in a clique. So this is very intuitive. And if you simulate social dynamics like this, this is exactly what you will find. But now, for the first time, we can actually ask, is this true? Is this the case for real transmission on networks? Because instead of simulating it, we can ask these questions of the real data. And it turns out, no. It turns out that the most socially influential individuals within these real groups are the individuals who have a low degree and whose neighbors have a high clustering coefficient, exactly the opposite of what has always been assumed using theory. So again, stressing the importance of actually testing these ideas within real systems. But of course, we can ask, why is this the case? And it turns out there's some complexities, again, you can see in our paper, but it turns out it's largely because social contagion is not a simple contagion like a disease, it's a so-called complex contagion. Now, let's turn to a disease again, a simple contagion. Now, the longer and closer I have proximity to my colleague here, probabilistically, the more likely I'm going to infect him. But let's say I have an opinion, let's say regarding our good friend Donald Trump, and I want to convince my colleague here of my opinion. Now, I could spend all day trying to convince him. I could spend all week trying to convince him. He may, probably not, I hope not, be convinced, at least if anyway. Donald Trump's too polarizing a factor here. But the point is when you're dealing with social information, it's a decision-making paradigm. It's not the same as a disease. Furthermore, what we know now from fish, from birds, from humans, is that individuals are seeking reinforcement from multiple other individuals. So they're not just, if one individual gives a stimulus, they will not transition across a threshold. They require another individual at least. Furthermore, our fish do something kind of clever. They depend on information coming in from different parts of the visual field to decorrelate the information. They're acting as coincidence detectors. And this means that communication is a complex contagion. And so I may influence you a little bit, like towards threshold, but not across threshold. But then I influence you, who influences you, and you then talk later, and then I influence you indirectly. And so these loops turn out to be very, very important. And so suddenly, this complex, real, stochastic biological system turns out to be remarkably deterministic. We can actually freeze time, trigger an individual, so we know which individual is going to show this reflex response. We can reconstruct the visual fields of all of the individuals, utilize our knowledge of how the visual field is translated into behavioral response, and predict not only who will be infected, so to speak, by behavior, but when they will be and how far it will propagate. And suddenly this incredibly noisy, stochastic system becomes remarkably deterministic. Because of this new relationship between social network structure and social influence. But it took us years and years to do this. And one of the big challenges in the study of collective behavior is it's very difficult to infer causality beyond the first responder. And we're always struggling with this problem. We're also, I'm sure, as in neuroscience, using informational type of techniques, but they're always falling below our standards. And so we developed a new technique called immersive holographic virtual reality, whereby we can put real animals into the same environment as, virtual animals into the same environment as real animals in a truly holographic display. And this sounds a bit science fiction, but I'll give you an example now. Your brain, I'm going to show you this is an illusion. I'm not going to lie to you. This is an illusion. Okay, I'm telling you right now, but you cannot but see this as a three-dimensional Rubik's Cube. Even though I'm telling you it's an illusion, we can zoom in. Your brain is completely convinced this is a three-dimensional object. This is how strong this illusion is. It's an anamorphic illusion. And we'll break it very shortly. And so you can see it wasn't 3D after all. And of course, as you zoom in on the camera is moving around, and your brain still believes the illusion. It's actually very resilient to minor changes. But of course, if you moved dramatically, then this poor person would have to print out another sheet and another sheet and another sheet. But if you do this in a computer, we can recompute this illusion 100 frames per second for the organism. And so we can genuinely create holographic environments for animals. And so this is just showing you the principle of the illusion. We have a real zebrafish at the top, a virtual zebrafish below. We project this onto a bowl, controlling, of course, for distortion. And this is work with John Stowers and Max Hofbauer, who set up a company called Loop Bio to commercialize this technology, and Andrew Straw at the University of Freiburg, with whom they previously worked. And so this pillar doesn't exist. It's an illusion. There's no such thing. But to this zebrafish, this is time sped up. Of course, it believes it to be there. And so we have developed this to work with virtual animals. So at the top in B, you see a zebrafish, a real zebrafish, the body posture changing over time. This is a juvenile, a larva. And you can see we've tracked the body posture. We recreate this virtual zebrafish, which you show on the left. So a photorealistic virtual fish that we can now put in with the real organism in three-dimensional space. And so you can see which one the virtual fish is because I've given it a very unrealistic trajectory. But you can see the real fish is interacting fully in 3D space with this holographic display of a virtual conspecific. And we have 7 of these systems, we can then link them together. So the individuals, because this illusion only works from the perspective of one individual, we cannot put 2 individuals together in the same bowl, but we have 7 of these bowls, and we can network them together in what we call the matrix. So each individual is interacting with the others in the same holographic space. And so now we have 2 individuals that are not really in the same space as each other, but they're interacting in the same holographic space as each other. And now we can see 5 individuals, or 4, sorry, interacting with each other within the same holographic environment. And so this is very much like the dynamical patch clamp in neuroscience. We can now put algorithms in the loop with the real biological systems. We can put these organisms together. We control causality for the first time. And we can also do very high throughput experiments where we give exactly the same stimulus on the same part of the retina to multiple individuals. We can do all sorts of cool stuff. In fact, the bifurcation diagram in the Nature Methods paper was 1 day worth of experiments. It's extremely high throughput, allowing us to really understand these systems. I'm very excited about this new technology. Okay, so in the last part of my talk, I want to talk about leadership and collective decision-making within animal groups. I'm going to start with some old work that looks at how groups come to consensus decisions. So back in the olden days of 2005. But this is only because it sets the scene for some very recent experimental tests. And so, again, I'm going to show you pictures of fish, but please think more broadly than this. So this individual has a goal-oriented behavior, but the others do not know that it does. They can't read each other's minds. And so we can ask, do individuals need to signal, I know what's going on, follow me? No evidence of that at all. They do not do so. There's no individual recognition. And so how then can information be conveyed within these groups? And so using a very simple model where I'm going to show in bright colors who has information so we can see that. So in the model, there's no cheating going on. You cannot read the mind of any other individual. But we can see through colors what the informational status is. This individual in bright red has a goal-oriented direction plus its social vector. But you can see it's a very short goal-oriented direction. It's not too hungry. It doesn't want to leave the group. But of course, we can make this a long vector as well, which means it very strongly wants to go in that direction. And so we can ask, if we have a preferred direction within these groups, can information be conveyed without individual recognition and without signaling? And so I'm going to have 1, 5, or 10 uninformed individuals in a group of 100. And the green cross just shows you the centroid of the group. Now, 1 individual is unable to guide the group. But 5 individuals, after an initial period of reorganization where they occupy the periphery of the group, you can begin to see they kind of convey the right information. They're sort of moving the right way. But 10 informed individuals suddenly and spontaneously move very accurately. Now, we can quantify this accuracy from 0, which is no information transfer, to 1, which is perfect information transfer. And I should note these are stochastic simulations. And you can see for all group sizes, as we increase the proportion of informed individuals, we increase very sharply at first this ability for the information to be conveyed. And so if we look at 85% accuracy, for example, in a group of 10, we need around half of the individuals to have information. But if we go to a larger group, such as a group of 200, we now need less than 5% to have the information. If you simulate migratory groups or cell collectives, this can be an infinitesimal proportion. And yet, to the observer, it looks like everybody has the information. And so we can actually test this with real fish. This is not a model. These are real individuals. The red ones are informed, the blue are uninformed, and again, we can see this very clear nonlinear response. But what about if there are differences in opinion? What about if some individuals want to go one way and others prefer a different direction? Can these groups come to a consensus regarding where to go? Now, if I'm going to ask us today, let's all go to the pub together, which I think is an excellent idea, actually, and say 11 of you had an idea for one pub and 10 of you had a different idea, and the rest of you didn't know Denver. You know, I'd ask the question, you'd put your hands up, I'd calculate, I'd pass back the answer. But of course, these individuals can't do that. And so it turns out that it's not just the number of individuals, but it's also the strength of their preferences that matter, which I'll come back to in a moment. And not just that, but it's also the degree to which they disagree. And so I'm going to plot in the following way the preferred direction of one group. So I'm going to stick one group at 0 degrees. They're always going to want to go 0 degrees. That's the bottom dotted line. They're fixed in that preference. And then I'm going to change the angle to which the other group disagrees with them. If it's also 0 degrees, it's the same as I showed you before with leadership, but they could change by a little bit, and that's the top dotted line. All the way up to 180 degrees on the far right, where they actually want to go in exactly opposite directions. And so if we have 5 individuals wanting to go one way, and 5 wanting to go the other way, in a group of 100, you can see this result. So we run thousands and thousands of simulations and ask, where does the group go? You can see below a critical difference of opinion of around 135 degrees, the group will split the difference and go in the average direction. And so if we have the group below this critical difference, they will move in the average direction. However, as soon as that angle, for example, if they're moving towards two targets, the angle will always be exceeded, and they will start to break symmetry and randomly move in one direction or the other. This is not the group splitting. This is just the average of many, many runs. They either go one way or the other. So they go from averaging to winner takes all. Now, instead of having 5 versus 5, let's say we have 6 versus 5. They start at random positions, random orientations, there's no signaling, there's no explicit communication. And now we have the same plot here, but now you'll see the group almost always comes to a consensus to choose the majority preferred direction. Again, the individuals cannot count. Before, as we saw, below this critical angle, they'll choose the average, but now as soon as we break that angle, they will almost always choose the majority preferred direction. So the individuals are very effective at voting on the move and coming to a collective consensus, even though no individual is capable of doing so. Now, if we have 10 that want to get to the white target and 10 to the red target, and the green and uninformed, it will be random which one they choose. In this case, they're choosing the red target. But if I add just one extra white individual to the group, with local, noisy interactions, over 98% of the time, they will choose the majority preferred target, even though they cannot count. But if the omega, if that strength of preference gets too strong, then the group can no longer come to consensus, and they will tend to split and divide themselves between the options. But the consensus regime is very, very strong. And we also have this type of challenge in many other types of groups where there's conflict of interests. Some might want one option, others might want another option. How do we come to consensus? Now, before I showed you, if there's a majority versus a minority, the majority will tend to spontaneously win. But you may think to yourselves, well, you just said these are selfish individuals. What's to stop the minority just becoming more strongly opinionated to try to get their own way, so increasing their vector strength? Does that work? And so I'm going to show you just an example of 6 individuals versus 5. The reason being, I'm going to give you experimental examples shortly. And I will also show you in an analytical model that these exact numbers do not matter. So this is just illustrative. So we have 6 versus 5. And I'll fix the majority preference, the weight of their preference, their omega, at 0.3. And you can see that if the minority also has an omega of 0.3 on the left, on the x-axis, the majority wins almost 100% of the time, as I just showed you. However, if this minority becomes more and more strongly opinionated along this x-axis, they'll get to 0.5, which means half of the time the majority wins, half of the time the minority wins. But eventually, if the minority are strongly enough opinionated, they will dictate the motion of the entire group. So it seems to make sense to be extremely strongly opinionated. However, this was the case where everybody in the group has a preference. Now, in nature, we are dealing with animals that are moving around in a complex world. They're mixing together. We have fission, fusion groups. They have lots of different forms of information. And so in many cases, we have individuals who do not know about the options available. Or they do know about them, but they don't care whether they go left or right. So previously, uninformed individuals have just been considered to add noise to these types of dynamics. So we wouldn't expect it to change anything. However, what we showed is that that's absolutely untrue. So here, if the minority has a stronger preference than the minority will win around 60% of the time with no uninformed individuals. You can see if we add 10 or 12 stupid individuals to the group, they actually push control to the majority. Now, if everybody's uninformed, of course, the group can no longer make a good decision. But we can increase the minority preference strength further And further still, now, if there's just minority and majority, the minority are so strongly opinionated, they will almost always win. But if we again put in unbiased or uninformed individuals, we return control to the majority. We democratize the decision-making process. And we then asked, is this a general principle? This could explain why we don't see these arms races within animal groups, but is this a general principle? There are many systems where individuals can influence others and are influenced by others. There are technological systems, there are, of course, neural systems, and social systems. So we created a ridiculously simple model to try to understand what's going on, where we had two preferences. So we get rid of space altogether, and we just have a network where the edges represent connections. And so this individual prefers the red option, arbitrarily, and this one the green option. And each one has a small probability of changing its neighbor's state. In this case, it didn't change state. But in addition to interacting just with one other individual, you can interact with multiple individuals, in this case with two others. And all we assume is that if the probability of being influenced by one green individual is Q, now the probability is slightly greater than 2 times Q. So there's a synergistic effect of multiple individuals. That's the only mathematical thing you need here. And that will increase the probability, not deterministically, stochastically, of changing the individual state. So not very controversial, and not very interesting also for 3 individuals. But if we simulate 10,000 individuals on a network, we can then see if the minority and majority have an equal strength of preference, the majority will win on the network. However, if we increase the minority preference strength, as we saw before, the minority can dominate if they're unwilling to give up on their preference. And if we have a small proportion of uninformed individuals in our network, nothing happens. They change nothing at all until a critical point where now a tiny proportion of individuals that don't care what the outcome is completely dictate what the outcome is, and the system flips from minority control to majority control. So the uninformed individuals or unbiased individuals have played a massive role in the social dynamics. And the nice thing about this particular model is we can actually prove this result using moment expansion and moment closure. And by we, I mean Thilo and Gervin, my collaborators. This is way beyond my own ability. Where we have the simulations here as circles and the analytic model as solid and dotted lines. And you can see there was only the possibility for this strongly opinionated minority to dominate if there were no uninformed individuals. And we get the appearance of a saddle node bifurcation, and the system flips to the stable majority state. So it's like in a neural network, if you have untuned cells in the network with cells that are tuned to different directions, for example, in directive selective cells, we should expect to see the same types of dynamics. And the nice thing about, there's also an unstable undecided state. The nice thing about the analytic model, we can get rid of lots of the complexity here and just look at the 2 factors that really matter, which is the relative strength of the minority preference on the x-axis and the numerical advantage of the majority. Now, if we have no uninformed individuals on our network, regardless now of its size, you can see that the minority of strongly opinionated individuals can dominate within this swathe of black. However, if we now have that critical proportion of unbiased nodes, nodes that don't care what happens, they didn't listen to both sides of the story, so to speak, then I'm going to show you the regime that switches from minority control to majority control. And it's massive. So now the minority of strongly opinionated individuals can only dominate in that tiny little sliver of black. The rest of phase space is completely dominated by the majority, regardless of how strong the minority want to win. They cannot enforce that on the system. The dynamics do not allow it. And so we've also shown this within physical systems, such as spin systems. We've shown this in coupled oscillator models. And very recently, we've been able to prove this result in a fully spatial model with NeoGov at the Weizmann Institutes. So we think this is a general principle, that a small proportion of unbiased individuals, untuned individuals, sort of, in a way, if you want to create a network that's really good at doing something, just let them be noisy and add in individuals that are completely untuned. And it will spontaneously make the system very, very accurate in terms of majority decision-making. They increase the probability the collective can reach consensus. They massively increase the speed at which consensus is reached and the sensitivity of collective decision-making. It's a quite unintuitive, but mathematically rigorous result. So our theoretical prediction, of course, is that it's testable. We want to test this idea. And it should be that uninformed or unbiased individuals should inhibit the influence of a strongly opinionated majority and return control to, minority, and return control to the numerical majority. So returning to our school in fish, working with postdoc Christos Wanu, who's now a lecturer at Bristol University in the UK, we did experiments where Christos was completely blind to the predictions of the model. And he trained individuals to a blue target or a yellow target. Now, to fish, yellow is like the crack of fish world. They have a strong preference for the same training to that target. So there are strongly opinionated individuals. We can then put them together with blue-trained individuals. And we can also put individuals that have no training in the loop. And the theory of the groups is on the left. And you can see if we have this strongly opinionated minority, they dominate the decision-making. But as we predicted, if you put in 5 or 10 untrained individuals with no preferences into the group, we spontaneously return control to the numerical majority. They democratized the decision-making process. So counterintuitively, the messiness of the system, the lack of tuning of the system, the noise in the system actually stabilizes it and makes it much, much more accurate at choosing the majority versus minority. And I think this could matter in neural systems. If you're trying to decide whether the world is moving left or moving right, you could either have all your cells tuned to be really good at that job, or let them be pretty crappy, and then put in around 12 to 15% of cells that don't care, but play a part in the network, and we predict that that should do the same job as having a very, very finely tuned system, which for natural selection might be much, much easier to find. It also makes a prediction about other animal groups. For example, we can go to groups such as baboons, which are famous for highly dominant hierarchies. And we can ask, does this work? And so this is work led by my PhD student, Ari Strandberg-Peshkin, who's just joined us at Constance as a junior professor. And so we put GPS collars and magnetometers and acceleration units on almost all adults within a wild, unhabituated baboon troop in Kenya. The first time this has ever been done. Of course, we didn't put it on juveniles for obvious ethical reasons. And these are the raw data. The colors just represent whether it's male, female, or subadult, which turns out not to matter at all. But in these data, we found tens of thousands of examples where some individuals go one way and some individuals go another way. And yet, like the fish, they will come to a consensus regarding where to travel. And you see the individuals at the bottom will give up and will move with the crowd. And I thought, this is amazing. Now we can finally test these ideas, not with fish, but with wild primate groups. And it turned out that the dominance hierarchy, so all males are dominant to all females, and it's a linear hierarchy. That's an aggression hierarchy. Who can beat anyone else up? Turns out to play no role whatsoever in terms of where the group goes, for example, to find food. And returning to these bifurcation diagrams that I showed you from that 2005 paper, we were finally able to replicate these very accurately from a wild primate group. That shows that this principle, even though the systems are very, very different in their cognition, these principles are so strong, they're so predictive across different system scales that we think this is a pretty important result. But of course, these baboons are not moving within an empty tank like the fish. They're moving within a complex habitat in Kenya. Now, this looks like a photograph, but it's not. This is actually a three-dimensional point cloud. And so this is me with the drone that we use. It's called a SenseFly EB drone that we use to map the habitat down to 2 to 3 centimeter spatial resolution over the entire habitat that the baboons have. And that's Ari on my left, and Damien Farine, who's also a group leader at Max Planck now, on my right. And so we can now map the entire habitat that these baboons use. So we have their spatial positions within tens of centimeters every second, and we now have the three-dimensional structure. And if you zoom in, you can even see the tire tracks in these single-lane roads, and the luggers carved out of the roads to have water flowing away. It's amazing that we have this resolution. And so now we can put the animals back into the habitat in which they evolved. So genuinely in the real habitat here. And you can see them moving through, and we're going to slowly rotate the environment. And you can clearly see the structure of the environment is playing a very strong role in addition to the social interactions. And so, working with Bayesian methodology, we were able to create a way that we could take into account who can see whom within this three-dimensional landscape, whether there was objects in the way, like rocks or landscape or trees. We can also work out where animals have previously been, so we can incorporate their memory. We can also incorporate their priorities, where they want to go to. For example, in the evening, they want to get back to the sleeping grove where they sleep. And we can incorporate this in a formal mathematical way. And what was really surprising to us, it turns out that the baboons are not really interacting with the positions of where others are, as we'd always assumed. They're behaving much like ants. They're interacting with the trails that the others have left, presumably olfactory trails, because this works even in very occluded environments, where they tend to follow the majority just by the smell. So it really changed our opinion of what's going on in this system. And this is the nonlinear axis on the left here. And you can see that if we just include the social factors, it's not nearly as good at predicting where individuals go as if we include the habitat as well. And so I think we're at a revolutionary time in the study of animal behavior, where we can utilize new technologies, even with insects, to tag organisms in their natural environments. I also think there's huge potential to actually record from neural dynamics in these natural environments, and our tags are able to do so. In fact, we have a new system that's just been put up onto the International Space Station. The last piece came up in February that allows much smaller, much cheaper tags to be tracked anywhere on the planet. You don't need to have cell phone reception, for example. The International Space Station will recover the data. And so I think this is a really unique time. And this is just to highlight some work that we've been doing that's, I hope, accepted in science. It seems accepted in science, where we're able to have every single wing beat of these animals, plus how they're interacting with the physical environment over their entire lifetimes. So no longer are we constrained to the laboratory environment to do these types of studies. We can have very robust, rigorous approaches under natural conditions. We're also utilizing drone technologies. For example, this is some tracking of buffalo. But because the drones have pretty crappy battery life, we have another drone coming in to replace the focal drone. It's now reorienting itself, and once it's reoriented and they're happy, that drone will go back to base to get recharged, and this one will then zoom in and allow us to resume the tracking. So we can track pretty much indefinitely, at least during daylight hours. And then using machine learning, deep learning technologies, we can track the motion of these wild animals and even be able to identify who is whom, such as buffalo versus zebra, for example. And of course, we take into account, using our 3D imaging, the landscape in which these animals are actually behaving. So I think it's a really exciting time to study behavior in the natural environment. Now, I moved from Princeton to Constance about 3 years ago. Constance is a beautiful historic city on the border of Switzerland. They left the lights on during the war because it was on the border of Switzerland, so we have one of the largest historic old cities in Germany. We're famous because of the lake. This is Alex Jordan, one of the PIs in my department, working out on the lake. If you don't know where Constance is, it's on this beautiful Lake Constance overlooking the Alps, the gateway to the Alps. And we're about 50 minutes from Zurich Airport. It's about an hour to Austria, an hour and a half to France, hour and a half to Italy, really in the heart of Europe. Very exciting place to be. We have just got 32 million euros from the German government to create the first ever building for the study of collective behavior, specifically to put computer scientists and biologists together in the same facility with virtual reality network environments, and also a 15 by 15 by 8 meter imaging hangar for virtual reality and immersive reality environments. And I thank you all very much for listening. We have positions available, and I'd love to chat to any of you interested.
I'd like to open the floor for obvious questions.
Thank you, that was a great talk. Do you imagine that the network dynamics of having uninformed individuals hold in densely connected networks as well as sparsely connected networks?
Yes, they do hold in densely connected networks. We know that for sure. In fact, I'm sorry, because of the lights, I can't actually see where the questions are coming from. So if I'm looking vaguely around, it's over here. Yeah, so we have that in the science paper. We also have a fully mixed model that shows the same results.
Thank you.
Okay, right there, yeah.
Great talk. I'm a fan of your work. A lot of animals are not like fish. They have more cognitive complexities. And the networks, as well as their cognitive abilities, for instance, their memory properties, get involved in their collective behavior. We've done some experiments with humans, how conversation changes collective memories depending on network structure and propagation, but we found that the only models that work are those that take into account certain memory processes. I wonder to what extent you talked about habitat and network structures, but I wonder to what extent you think in your future work, working with other species perhaps, you would consider including cognitive principles within that species that interact.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I'm sorry I didn't make that clear enough. But in the baboon study, we did include memory. We include memory of who's whom, and also memory of where they've been, and also memory of where they want to go. So that was the first study where we explicitly incorporated memory. And now fish seem dumb, maybe to many of you, but half of all vertebrates are fish. And fish have been shown to pass all of the same psychological tests as has primates. I mean, they're not generalists. You know, you can find one species of fish that passes this test, another species that passes that test. Then I'm not saying they're as smart as primates, but certainly they offer us scope to look at the relationship between cognition and collective behavior. And I would say that the challenge that I want to sort of address over the next 5 to 10 years is putting the cognition into collective cognition.
Yep.
What does individual cognition give you more than these types of self-organized rules?
Can I ask a second question? You talked about the speed of movement changing when the environment was volatile or it was less volatile in terms of collecting information. I wonder whether you're thinking or whether it seems like if you wanted to model it, it's a collective agent and its learning rate is changing depending on the volatility.
In that particular example, there was no learning whatsoever.
Okay.
That was an example where we had this model that individuals were performing some sort of Bayesian updating and they were doing all this clever stuff. Our model was great. However, the fish weren't doing at all what the model predicted.
Right, that's what
and it's possibly because, you know, the brain is very, very expensive to run. It's 10 times more expensive than any muscle cell, for example. And so natural selection should, in these collective systems, be expected to find computationally minimal solutions at the individual level, but where the network of communication among the individuals brings up the, you know, performs the computation. But we know so little about this. There are so many people focusing on the individual. There are so few people. For example, we're doing some studies now. We're just about to submit a paper where we looked at groups of rats solving a maze. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. That's a terrible pun. It's really incredible how these groups actually solve the problem. And of course, rats are social. They've evolved to be social, so it shouldn't be a surprise to us. But to our knowledge, no one has ever even looked at that paradigm example of rats in a maze in a collective way. So I think one of the things I would really like to emphasize is if you're looking at social organisms, which are like humans, rats, pigeons, you know, other classic organisms, you know, really think about the social. And I think there's lots of ways that we could learn from neuroscience and vice versa.
Over on this side.
Thank you for the talk. That was really interesting. I was wondering if you have gotten the opportunity to apply some of these principles to social networking data that might be available either publicly or through discussions with private companies.
Yeah, we're doing a current study right now that's incredibly controversial. So it's unpublished. So we're about to replicate this, but the results look very strong. I'd be happy to show you on my laptop later, where we actually, I mean, many of us who work in collective behavior were kind of shocked by what happened in the US when Trump came in. And I spent a long time going, oh my God, why am I studying fish when I could be trying to help? And so we started studying human collective decision-making and individual decision-making in relation to political opinions. And our preliminary, very preliminary, unpublished data suggests that all sort of demographics of the US, that was where we're doing the study, are very similar in terms of how they prioritize information, how they associate confidence with accuracy, except for the far right. The far right have an inversion, where the more confident they are, the less accurate they are regarding arbitrary decisions. And so we're now replicating this study. They're also the only group that does not pay attention to social information if it does not conform to their own information. And so we're now studying this on Twitter, we're studying this on artificial networks and doing lots of stuff on that right now. But as I said, very speculative, but yes, something that does tap in. My student who's working on this at Princeton calls this on fish and fascists, this particular study. But we'll see.
Thank you.
On this side?
So returning to the fish from the fascists, I was interested in the finding that fish with more connections are less influential than fish with more. And I was wondering if that might be caused by the fact that connections are line of sight. So if you have fish near the fish, then they're going to block the view. They'll tend to have fewer connections, but those connections might be stronger.
Right. No, so you pick up on a very, very good point. There's lots of subtleties here. For example, there are trivialities, such as if you're at the edge of the group, by definition, you've got less connections. And so controlling for that, we still find that having less connections is more influential. But of course, individuals at the edge of the group really are super influential to the individuals. So unfortunately, it's a little bit difficult to go through these details right now, but I'd be very happy to chat to you later to go through the details of the paper. But we really try to control for all of these different factors, such as trivialities associated with position within the group. And it really genuinely is the network effect, not the positional effect, that matters.
Right, on this side?
Hi, thank you. That was a really phenomenal talk. I agree with you that these ideas that you have applied to animal behavior could be really interesting in studying neural networks, but and also in more complex human behavior. But one of the biggest challenges in studying the brain and in modern human society is that we're talking about millions or billions of individual participants in these interactions. So my first question is, at very large numbers, do some of these phase transitions in the behaviors, do they either become non-universal or become very isolating in subpopulations? And my second question is how, just generally, as the complexity of interactions increase and the size of the networks increase, how well do you think these ideas can be applied directly to other systems?
It's a really great question. I mean, I think on average, we think of things the other way around, whereas these types of ideas tend to apply very, very well for very large system sizes, but may break down for small system sizes. However, having said that, we've been limited to around 1,000 or 2,000 individuals within our studies. Now, when you start dealing with 10,000 individuals, I would say we don't have any idea. Computationally, we do, of course. Our models, the phase transition type dynamics, really hold only in the systems that are infinite, right? So we have phase-like transitions for smaller systems that seem to hold within the systems we look at. But I would not at all be surprised. I mean, I'm so jealous of you guys. You have a huge community working together to try and solve these problems. We're like one of the only labs in the world trying to do this. And, you know, every year we sort of have to rechange our whole thinking because we discover something new. We now begin to think that the groups aren't really like some homogeneous mixed thing. They're actually groups within groups and so on. And so that then changes our thinking about how correlated information works, how decision-making works, and so on. So I would say I don't know. I'm so excited about the technologies allowing us to increasingly large system sizes. And the more interaction we have I think with this type of community, the better for us as well, because you're a much more mature community that really knows what you're talking about. We're just, trying to understand these systems sort of as we go, because, I mean, if you're interested in how, the environment change is going to influence, I mean, most of the systems that are being really impacted by climate change are collective systems. Not a great surprise, but it's absolutely true. But no one is studying it. I mean, no one is studying locusts, yet 1 in 10 people on the planet are being impacted by locusts. I just don't understand it. But anyway, come and join us. It's fun.
We'll do one more question. Last one.
This is kind of a clarifying follow-up on what Jason asked, but the phase transitions that you see in terms of decision-making when you have equal populations with opposite preferences and the degree of opposition that is required for the group to follow one and not the other, I was wondering how those kinds of things change as you change the size of the group.
Yep. So they become much, much more nonlinear as the system size increases. So, they're kind of blurred for small system sizes. As the system size becomes larger, it becomes very, very nonlinear. And you begin to not see the junction. You see this very steep transition between these different states as system size increases, which is, again, what you'd expect mathematically.
Okay, cool.
But it's what we also see experimentally, by the way.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Ian's here till Sunday. You can keep asking questions, likely at some fine pub in Denver somewhere. So, all right. Let's thank him.
Cheers. Thank you.